Good day to you. Culture. What does that word mean? What does that term mean? Why is it that we use the word as a plural form, cultures? Shouldn't there be one culture? I mean, if you're like me, you probably recall that from somewhere along the way in your public education, if that's what you had, you learned that human beings can all be traced back to one person, a female probably, in Africa. 200,000 years ago. You may not remember those years, but you may remember that. So why is there not one culture? Well, there's lots of reasons for that, and that's what we're going to talk about in this chapter. We're going to try and get a handle on what that word culture means, and I want to tell you right up front, you're probably going to be frustrated because there is no single definition of culture, which is also the beauty of the term. We're going to study a term that has many dimensions to it. So let's get started. Why is there not one culture? Well, geographic reasons and also climate reasons and food shortages started to force people out of Africa. They needed something to eat. They're living in the desert. They had to go find food. Also, the climate was very hot, very deserty, very arid, if you know what that means, hard to grow things. So people started seeking other places, and those people, those early human forms, started to migrate out of Africa. They went to Asia. They came into Europe. They eventually migrated across the Alaskan Strait into North America, came down through North America and down into Central and Latin America. So people started to migrate. And once they got separated from each other, they started growing up in their own communities. And so you would have people living in vastly different parts of the world. And that's when they started to form their own belief systems and their own structures to the ways of living. They started to look differently because of climate changes and the effect of sun and also their genes. And so we start to get a plurality of cultures, not just one single culture, but a plurality of cultures where people have different ways of seeing the world. They're looking differently. They have different beliefs, and they are, in essence, different cultures. So let's talk now about what culture is. There's lots of different definitions of it. And those definitions are provided in the book. I'm pulling them out of one particular part of the chapter, and I'm moving it to this part of my instructor video because I believe it makes most sense to do that. I mean, I can do that, right? I'm the professor for the class. So I'm going to think that I can do that. So I hope we'll make it easier for you. So let's talk about the first definition of culture. The first definition is a community at large that is able to sustain itself. So it has to be large enough to sustain itself. That means that it can propagate, that it can have its own offspring that then grow up and continue the community. We have an example of that here in the U.S. where that didn't work. If you study history, you know about Jamestown, and you know the first settlers that came to Jamestown in Virginia, and they didn't make it through the first winters. So they weren't big enough to be able to sustain themselves, to build forts, etc. So that's not what would be considered a culture. Now let's go on to the next definition. Culture can also be considered to be the totality of a group's patterns of behaviors. So if you look at the way that an entire community behaves, the totality of it is what defines that community as being a culture. And when we talk about those behaviors, we're talking about three things in particular. We're talking about symbols. Symbols are the verbal and nonverbal expressions of language. Like in the U.S., how you doing? That means thumbs up, means okay. That may mean the number one in another culture. So it's a symbol that we have a common understanding of, making us a culture. Rituals are the way that activities take place within a culture. 4th of July here in the U.S., there are certain givens that you do. You have a barbecue, you watch fireworks, you at some point think about how glad you are to be an American. That's what we do as a ritual for 4th of July in our culture. And then thirdly, there are values. Values that are feelings that are not open for discussion. They're feelings about certain things that are taken for granted. And they're also behaviors that are not open for discussion. Try going to a baseball game, for example, and before the game starts, standing up when the national anthem is playing and not taking your hat off. You're going to be persona non grata. And if you don't stand up, same thing. So that's not open for discussion. You don't have somebody saying, I'd rather not do this. I want to dissent. I don't believe that I'm a citizen of the world. I don't belong to America specifically. I'm just here to see a baseball game. No, that's not going to really fly. You're going to feel a lot of pressure to stand up, take your hat off, and sing the national anthem. A third definition of a culture is the transmission of thoughts and behaviors across generations. So when you grow up in a family, you have certain values and behaviors with respect to religion, with respect to how you celebrate Christmas or Hanukkah, to pick out two examples of holidays that your family expects you to continue on. And often we see this in the form of meals. I'm going to make spaghetti the way that my mom taught me to make it. That's a passing on of culture through generations. Yet another definition of culture is members who identify themselves with a group. Okay? Are you a Phillies fan? Okay? That's a group of people. That says a lot about you. It says that you can't stand the New York Mets, for example. So that makes you part of a group. You belong to the Phillies group. It's members who identify themselves with a larger group. And then finally, my own definition, which I find the simplest, but also maybe the most comprehensive of culture, is that it's the routine ways that we lead our lives. The routine ways. When you get up in the morning, from morning till night, what are the things that you do that make you part of a culture? Now, I'm a professor. So I'm part of a professor culture, and my routine often involves getting up and preparing for class and then delivering a lecture. And then along the way, there's going to be some grading. I'm also going to be meeting with students to advise them. And at some point, I'm going to find some time to do some research to publish my ideas. This is my routine way that makes me part of a professor culture. You have your own routine ways, no matter what you're doing in life, that defines you from a cultural standpoint. All right, now let's go into some of the markers that make that are supposed to be what is behind creating a culture. And these markers are 6 markers. They come from the sociologist David Cannondine, and he says these things are behind what creates a culture. So the first marker is religion. Religion is one of the oldest ways that we define ourselves as a culture. And religion is such a strong identifier of culture that we've had so much conflict throughout history because of people with different religious beliefs. I mean, religion, in actual fact, is responsible for tens of millions of people. And the most common time period that's cited for that is the Crusades in Europe, where many people who were non-Catholics were killed. Not picking on the Catholics here, because there are many other religious feuds, conflicts that are going on, because religion is such a strong identifier that people who believe that their God is a certain particular, is a certain depiction, they conflict with somebody else who, with a culture that has a completely different religious standpoint, where maybe that God doesn't even exist. Like the Muhammad God versus the Christian God, those conceptions are so different that the Muhammad God, according to Islam, you cannot even depict visually because it's insulting. It lowers that deity down to human status. So it's seen as sacrosanct to do that. So when you have religion as your identifier, oftentimes it creates conflict with other cultures. Not always, but oftentimes. Moving on now, the next marker for creating culture is national and cultural identities. It's difficult to perceive of a time when there was no United States, but prior to the 1800s, you didn't have geographic boundaries, political boundaries. You didn't have political boundaries being so hard and fast because people were free to roam. A lot of groups and communities of people were nomads, especially if you're living in desert areas. You move around to where the food is. You move to where the rainfall is coming during this particular season, and then when it's gone, you move somewhere else. You don't respect whether there's a boundary between you and another country. But in the 1800s, we started to get the rise of nation states. The idea that our boundary is the Rio Grande between Mexico and the United States. And that has led to the formation of people perceiving themselves as belonging to a nation. That's what it means when you ask yourself, what does it mean to be an American? Well, it means we're hardworking. It means that we have the chance for upward mobility. These are cultural things that come with the nation state of living in the United States. Of course, when you have boundaries that seem to be somewhat arbitrary, like the Crimea, and it was part of Ukraine until a couple years ago, and Russia said, you know what, most of the people in the Crimea share our ethnic heritage, so Russia went down and retook the Crimea from Ukraine. So that was an unnatural boundary, and the nation state didn't hold together as well as it does in a place like the United States, where you have a big river between us and Mexico. Next up, as a marker, is class and identity. And this work is most closely associated with Karl Marx and Engels, the Englishman. He doesn't get as much credit, but Marx says that Entities are created by the relation to the means of production. Now that may seem kind of abstract to you, but you have to consider that during this time period we had industrialization, where things were not being made by hand so much anymore, but they were being made by factories. And the people who owned the factories, they were the capitalists, and the people who worked in the factories, they were the proletariat. So your relation to the means of production, if you're the person who doesn't have any control over how those goods are produced, then you're in a substandard position. You're a proletariat. You have to accept the wages that are given to you and the working conditions and when you get paid. Whereas if you're the capitalist, you get to control where your money's being spent. You get to control who you employ. You get to control much more having to do with your lifestyle. That's the idea that class and identity are defining culture. A person who came along who developed that idea further was Max Weber, W-E-B-E-R. He's a sociologist, and he said that class is not so much determined by the means of production, but by skill and education. And that still is why many people are going to college today, right? That's why you're sitting in a class like this during the summer on a nice day like this, because you're trying to get that bachelor's degree so that you have a credential that is an educational credential, and that's going to give you opportunities that you would not otherwise have had. Next up is the idea of gender and identity. And this way of thinking is that we are defined, our culture that we fit into is defined by our gender. Now, gender is not sex. Sex is what you're biological born with your chromosomes, your Y chromosomes and your X chromosomes. Gender is society's perception of you based on society's perception of your masculinity or your femininity, and whether you fall somewhere in between, because it's a continuum. Some people are really, really masculine, other people are feminine, and then there are different levels of between this. So the way that you are treated in life based on your gender is a defining feature of culture. So, for example, in the United States, you grow up, if you're a boy and you start playing with a Barbie doll, the average parent is going to say, here, no, try this truck instead. Because the idea is, since you're a male or female gender, that this physical toy that you're playing with should be related to society's perception of what a male or a female should be doing. Then we have the concept of subculture. Subculture is where a small culture exists within a larger culture. So the subculture shares characteristics of larger culture, but yet it's very, very different. So if you've been out to the middle of Pennsylvania, you've come across the Amish probably in the central part of PA. Now the Amish share some of the dimensions of our larger culture, like private property. They own their own land. They own lots of farms, actually. They're very productive and very wealthy, the Amish are. But then they also have their own subculture. Their own subculture says that, we are going to shun technology. It's not part of our religion. So if you drive past an Amish farm, you see no electricity going out to an Amish farm. That's how you can tell an Amish house. You don't see any power lines. It's a subculture. It has its own rules and set of rules, but it still shares some of the larger values. And then we have co-culture as a next marker. And co-culture is kind of a reaction to subculture, because subculture implies that the one culture is dominant, U.S. over Amish. Co-culture is trying to say they're equal. So they may be smaller, but they're equal to the larger one. So let's take American Indians, or Native Americans, a more appropriate way to describe people who were here before the settlers from Europe came. If you look at casinos on American Indian land, those casinos are allowed to be run by American Indians or Native Americans, and those rules that are setting up how those casinos are run are determined by the Indians. They have their own means of sustaining themselves, and they are seen as equal. We have similar things going on with various Native American tribes along the Canadian border, and the U.S. government trying to allow the expansion of a pipeline to bring oil from Canada into the U.S., and American Indians are saying, no, this is going to violate our water rights, our rights to the water in those areas. So we get to supersede the American government, and that's being played out in the court. I think you could say that's a co-culture, an example of a co-culture going on there. Now that we're done with those markers, now let's move on to the role of communication, why you have this actual course, Intercultural Communication, instead of just calling it Intercultural Studies. Communication plays a central role in the formation of culture, and there actually are two functions of communication. One is the means by which individuals learn appropriate behaviors. It's the means by which individuals learn appropriate behaviors. If you're an American and you go to Walmart and you're the first one to get to a door and you see an elderly lady coming up behind you, you see that lady may look at you like, you're going to hold the door for me, right? It's just a simple look like that tells you, yeah, this is an expected behavior on your part. And the way that I'm communicating that to you, if I'm the elderly person, is by the way that I look at you and the way that I'm hurrying up to the door to get there so that you don't have to wait any longer while you're holding it for me, as much as I can, even though I'm walking slower. This is an example of the means by which individuals learn appropriate behaviors in a culture. But then there is a second function of communication. That's the means by which individuals with one group identity interact with another group identity. It's the means by which those two groups interact. So, for example, when I go down to the liquor store and I'm going to buy a bottle of wine, a lot of times I see a car pulled up. It has New York license plates. It's not in the parking lot. It's at the curb. The windows are down. Hip hop is playing really loud. Okay, so that's not me saying, oh, those people shouldn't be able to do that. That's me saying, how do I interact with that? Do I say something like, should you not be parking in your parking spot? That's, are you special? There's a law against that. Or should I say, you know what, that's not the way that things are done in New York. So how could people expect, when you have such limited parking spaces in the city and people move from New York to the Poconos, they're going to continue the behaviors that they've been taught. So should I just pass them by and attribute it to their culture? So often that's what I do. I don't say anything. So the communication there is influencing me not to say anything because I'm interpreting what they're doing from their standpoint. In essence, communication and culture are inseparable. They are one and the same. Without communication, you cannot have culture. Without culture, you cannot have communication. And there are different cultural definitions of communication. There's not just one definition. One cultural definition of communication is the Confucian definition. The Confucian definition, which we can find in China and Singapore and many countries that have Chinese expatriates, including North Korea. That's not a country we would consider to be Confucian. A Confucian definition of communication stresses harmony. It stresses getting along. It stresses peace. It stresses being at one with nature, being at one with society, being at one with your family, being at one with the world. That's what Confucianism stresses. And part of that, there are certain values like virtue, or selflessness, or hard work, or respect for hierarchy. I remember when I was in China teaching a class called Comparative Media. I was teaching there a few summers ago. And every day in the morning from my dormitory room, I would hear this sound that went like this. It was a female, and her voice was being amplified, and she was sounding like this to me. Ha, hoo, ah, gee. Ha, hoo, ah, gee. And I said, I've got to go find out what this is. So I went downstairs, and I went out to the sidewalk, and I saw that there were little speakers that were planted in the ground every 20 feet or so all across the campus at Shanghai University. And I thought to myself, wow, from what I've learned in America, this must be Chinese propaganda. It must be something to do with supporting the Communist Party. So I went back to the dorm and I talked to the desk supervisor and I asked what this was about, and I found out it was the, quote, exercise lady. This is the lady who every morning encourages Chinese people to do sit-ups, push-ups, to breathe rhythmically, to take in fresh air. And this is something that Chinese culture has in it as a way of expressing harmony, getting people to start their day off, not with a jolt of coffee, not with jumping in the car and putting on the radio, but with a kind of at peace or harmony with your surroundings. Now let's move on to another definition of communication. Let's take on the Western perspective on communication, which originates with Aristotle in ancient Greece and his book called The Rhetoric. And this perspective holds that communication is a process. It's a process, and to look at it involves looking at the steps of communication and the components of it. And it's often based very much on equipment. As David Berlow, a researcher who came along and captured the process of communication as a kind of a technological process in which he said there is a source of the message. And that source encodes the message, decides what symbols to put it into. If you want to say thank you, you could say thank you by smiling, or you could say thank you by saying thanks very much, Or you could say thank you by saying thanks. There's big differences between those ways of saying thank you. That's how do you encode a message using certain symbols. And then there's the message itself. Then there's the channel that carries the message. You want to ask your parents for money while you're away at college. Do you call them? Do you send them a text? Or do you want to go show up in person? Because it's going to make a difference with how you are interpreted. So the channel is very important. Then you have noise, things that get in the way, like the sun behind my head, which I'm having to block out with my head. Otherwise, now it's gone. It's better now. That's anything that gets in the way of the message is noise. It's part of this process view of communication. And then you have the receiver. That's a person who receives the message. And then you have receiver feedback. That person sends a message back to the person that you're speaking to. Like when you're a professor and you're teaching a class and you get towards the end and people start packing up their books and zipping the backpacks before you finish. And they're saying, we're perceiving that class is done and we want to go. That's receiver feedback. Then you have decoding. That's how receivers understand the message. You may take your roommate's dishes and stack them in a pile next to the sink because you're trying to help them, but they may perceive it that you're saying, hey, you didn't do the dishes, and they may take it as an aggressive message. That's a difference in decoding the message. And then you've got feedback, which we already discussed. Sorry to mention that again. And context. Context is the history of the people involved in the communication. A lot of times, you have a context, especially if you're in a relationship with somebody, and if you start to express something that the other person doesn't like and they get their dander up, that may lead to an escalation much quicker than if you're just meeting somebody for the first time and you express those differences. That's because context is coming to play. This is a very different view of communication than the Confucian view. And then finally, we're going to wrap up our instructor-led lecture with mentioning how media plays an important part in intercultural communication, or I should say play an important part, because media is plural. There's no such word as mediums. Media is the plural of a medium. And we're talking about technological devices like telephones and the internet and mass media, and especially today's social media. Social media creating such a culture that it's really a phenomenon that we're just starting to get a handle on, especially with young people. I can tell you that I meet so many college students today who have a real phobia about speaking with other people, about sitting in a class. It may even be why some of you have taken this class, because it's an online class, and the idea of going into a classroom and sitting down and maybe having to do a presentation or interacting with strangers is very difficult today because we're so used to being confined to that device that we hold in our hand, and our eyes are constantly focused on something that is only 6 to 12 inches away from us as opposed to the outside world. And we're taught that we can send a message and that we don't have to be there in front of a person to see their reaction, that we can sort of confine ourselves to the safety of looking at the person's reaction on text instead of having to look at their face and all the awkwardness that goes along with that and having to overcome that. That's a part of communicating that was part of our past more than it is today. And so social media today, I'm kind of offering a little commentary here, has created some difficulties for our cultures. So there we have a lot of different dimensions of culture and a lot of different ways of looking at culture. And so when we see something like this drum and you see the colors, the first thing that you may be thinking is this looks like a reggae drum, right? The colors, the reggae drum, because you have the oranges and the red, but it's not. It's a drum that I got in Ghana, Africa, when I was writing my book, Comparing Media from Around the World. And it's not just a drum, it was a way of communicating. Before people could travel long distances and had cell phones, etc., if you wanted to communicate with the next village that you just killed a big animal and you have extra and people can come share it, you would do that by drum. But the reason that you might think it's reggae is because these colors, through the same process that I talked about earlier, where people migrated from Africa to seek better ways, and in the case of the drum and the Caribbean, it was through a means of that we consider to be a checkered past of our history, which is to say slavery, people being captured from Africa and brought to the Caribbean. Here we have the formation of culture in the Caribbean, which still exhibits dimensions of the originating culture, the colors that were present in Ghana, Africa. So we could say that that is a co-culture. If you want to look at the Caribbean, saying, where we share some dimensions of Ghana, Africa. We have their colors. We also, our reggae music is similar to Ghanaian music, but we are our own separate independent culture. We are Jamaica. We are St. Lucia. We are a Caribbean country. We're not an African country. So that's going to wrap up our first chapter on intercultural communication, defining culture and communication. I hope you have a great day.